Welcome back, everyone. Today we will be reading Chapter 4 of The Magicians, so let's get into it. Chapter 4. Magic. The study of magic is not a science, it is not an art, and it is not a religion. Magic is a craft. When we do magic, we do not wish and we do not pray. We rely upon our will and our knowledge and our skill to make a specific change to the world. This is not to say that we understand magic, in the sense that physicists understand why subatomic particles do whatever it is that they do. Or perhaps they don't understand that yet. I can never remember. In any case, we do not and cannot understand what magic is or where it comes from, any more than a carpenter understands why a tree grows. He doesn't have to. He works with what he has. With the caveat that is much more difficult and much more dangerous and much more interesting to be a magician than it is to be a carpenter. Delivering this edifying lecture was Professor March, whom Quentin had last seen during his examination. He was the round, red-haired man with the hungry lizard. Because he was plump and red-faced, he looked like he should be jolly and easygoing, but in actuality he was turning out to be kind of a hard-ass. When Quentin woke up that morning, the huge empty house was full of people. Yelling, running, noisy people who dragged trunks thunderously upstairs and occasionally banged open his door. Looked him over, and then slammed it shut again. It was a rude awakening. He'd gotten used to wandering around the house by himself as its undisputed lord and master, or at least, after Elliot, its senior undersecretary. But, as it turned out, there were 99 other students enrolled at Breakbills, divided into 5 classes that corresponded roughly to freshmen through first-year graduate student. They had arrived this morning en masse for the first day of the semester, and they were asserting their rights. They came in clumps, materializing 10 at a time on the back terrace, each group with a hillock of trunks and duffel bags and suitcases beside it. Everybody except Quentin was in uniform, striped blazers and ties for the guys, white blouses and dark tartan skirts for the girls. For a college, it all looked a whole lot like a prep school. It's jacket and tie at all times except in your room, Fogg explained. There are more rules. You'll pick them up from the others. Most boys like to choose their own ties. I am inclined to be lenient on that score, but don't test me. Anything too exciting will be confiscated, and you'll be forced to wear the school tie, which I know very little about these things, but I am told is cruelly unfashionable. When Quentin got back to his room, he found a closet full of identical jackets hanging there, dark blue and chocolate brown in inch-wide stripes, paired with white dress shirts. Most of them looked brand new. A few showed signs of incipient sheen at the elbows or fraying around the cuffs and smelled faintly, but not unpleasantly, of mothballs and tobacco and former occupants. He changed gingerly and looked at himself in the mirror. He knew that he was probably supposed to resent the uniform, but he relished it. If he didn't feel like a magician yet, at least he could look like one. Each jacket had an embroidered coat of arms on it, a golden bee and a golden key, on a black background dotted with tiny silver stars. He would later hear other students call this device the key and bee, and once he started looking for it, he saw it everywhere, worked into carpets and curtains, carved into stone lintels, pieced into the corners of parquet floors. Now, Quentin sat in a large square lecture hall, a corner room with high, lofty windows on 2 sides. It contained 4 rows of elegant wooden desks set on racked steps like an amphitheater, looking down on a large blackboard and a massive stone demonstration table that had been scorched, scratched, and scarred, and scathed within an inch of its life. Particles of chalk dust hung in the air. The class had 20 students, all in uniform, all looking like very ordinary teenagers trying very hard to look cooler and smarter than each other. Quentin knew that probably half of the Intel Science Talent Search winners and Scripps Spelling Bee champions in the country were in this room. Based on what he had overheard, one of the classmates had placed second in the Putnam competition as a high school junior. He knew for a fact that one of the girls had managed to take over the plenary session of the National Model UN and push through a motion sanctioning the use of nuclear weapons to protect a critically endangered species of sea turtle. This, while representing Lesotho. Not that any of that stuff mattered anymore, but the air was still thick with nerves. Sitting there in his new-smelling shirt and jacket, Quentin already wished he were back on the river with Elliot. Professor March paused, refocusing. "Quentin Coldwater, would you please come up to the front of the class? Why don't you do some of your magic for us?" March was looking straight at him. "That's right." His manner was warm and cheery, like he was giving Quentin a prize. "Right here." He indicated a spot next to him. "Here, I'll give you a prop." Professor March rummaged in his pockets and took out a clear glass marble, somewhat linty, and put it on the table where it rolled a few inches before it found a hollow to settle in. The classroom was absolutely still. Quentin knew this wasn't a real test. It was some kind of object lesson / hazing ritual. An annual thing. Probably nothing to worry about, just one more wonderful old Breakbills tradition. But his legs felt like wooden stilts as he made his way down the broad steps to the front of the class. The other students stared at him with the cold indifference of the gratefully spared. He took his place next to March. The marble looked ordinary, just glass with a few air bubbles in it, about the same circumference as a nickel. Probably about as easy to palm, too, Quentin supposed. With his brand-new school jacket on, he could cuff and sleeve it without too much trouble. All right, he thought, if it's magic they want, magic they shall get. Blood thundering in his ears, he produced it from either hand, from his mouth, from his nose. He was rewarded with scattering giggles from the audience. The tension broke. He hammed it up. He tossed the marble up in the air, letting it almost brush the high cathedral ceiling, then leaned forward and caught it neatly balanced in the hollow of the back of his neck. Somebody did a rim shot on his desk. The room broke up. For his grand finale, Quentin pretended to crush the marble with a heavy iron paperweight at the last second, substituting a mint lightsaber he happened to have in his pocket, which made a nice solid crunch and left behind a forensically convincing spray of white powder. He apologized profusely to Professor March, winking broadly at the audience, then asked him if he could borrow his handkerchief. When he reached for the handkerchief, Professor March discovered the marble in his own jacket pocket. Quentin executed a Johnny Carson golf swing. The first years applauded wildly. He bowed. Not bad, he thought. Half an hour into his first semester, and he was already a folk hero. "Thank you, Quentin," Professor March said uncourteously, clapping with the tips of his fingers. "Thank you. That was very enlightening. You may return to your seat. Alice, what about you? Why don't you show us some magic?" This remark was addressed to a small, sullen girl with straight, dark hair who'd been huddling in the back row. She showed no surprise at being picked. She looked like the kind of person who expected the worst at all times, and why should today be any different? She walked down the wide steps of the lecture hall to the front of the room, eyes straight ahead, cold-bloodedly ascending the gallows, looking hideously uncomfortable in her freshly creased uniform, and mutely accepted her marble from Professor March. taking her place behind the demonstration table, which came up to her chest. She steadied it on the stone tabletop. Immediately, she made a series of rapid, businesslike gestures over the marble. It looked like she was doing sign language or assembling a cat's cradle with invisible string. Her unfussy manner was the opposite of Quentin's slick, show-offy style. Alice stared at the marble intently, expectantly. Her eyes went a little crossed. Her lips moved, though from where he was sitting, Quentin couldn't hear what she was saying. The marble began to glow red, then white, becoming opaque, an eye clouding over with a milky cataract. A slender, undulating curl of gray smoke rose up from the point where it touched the table. Quentin's smug, triumphant feeling went cold and congealed. She already knew real magic, he thought. My God, I am so far behind. Alice rubbed her hands together. It takes a minute for my fingers to become impervious. Cautiously, as if she were retrieving a hot dish from an oven, Alice plucked at the glass marble with her fingertips. It was now molten from the heat, and it pulled like taffy. In 4 quick, sure motions, she gave the marble 4 legs, and then added a head. When she took her hands away and blew on it, the marble rolled over, shook itself once, and stood up. It had become a tiny, plump glass animal. It began to walk across the table. This time, no one applauded. The chill in the room was palpable. The hair stood up on Quentin's arms. The only sound was the soft tink, tink, ka-tink, tink, ka-tink of its pointy glass feet on the stone tabletop. "Thank you, Alice," Professor March said, regaining the stage. "For those of you who were wondering, Alice just performed 3 basic spells." He held up a finger for each one. Dempsey's silent thermogenesis, a lesser cavalier animation, and some kind of ward and shield that appears to be home-brewed. So maybe we should name it after you, Alice. Alice looked back at March impassively, waiting for the cue that she could go back to her seat. She wasn't even smug, just impatient to be released. Forgotten, the little glass creature reached the end of the table. Alice made a grab for it, but it fell and smashed on the hard stone floor. She crouched down over it, stricken, but Professor March was already moving on, wrapping up his lecture. Quentin watched the little drama with a mixture of compassion and rivalrous envy. Such a tender soul, he thought, but she's the one I'll have to beat. Tonight, please read the first chapter of Le Goff's Magical History in the Lloyd translation, March said, and the first 2 chapters of Amelia Popper's Practical Exercises for Young Magicians, a book that you will soon come to despise with every fiber of your innocent young beings. I invite you to attempt the first 4 exercises. Each of you will be performing one of them for the class tomorrow. And if you find Lady Popper's rather quaint 18th century English difficult, keep in mind that next month we will be starting Middle English, Latin, and Old High Dutch, at which time you will look back on Lady Popper's 18th century English with fond nostalgia. Students began stirring and gathering up their books. Quentin looked down at the notebook in front of him, which was empty except for one anxious zigzaggy line. Final thought before you go. March raised his voice over the shuffling clatter. I urge you again to think of this as a purely practical course, with a minimum of theory. If you find yourself becoming curious about the nature and origins of the magical powers you are slowly and very, very painfully cultivating, remember this famous anecdote about the English philosopher Bertrand Russell. Russell once gave a public lecture on the structure of the universe. Afterward, he was approached by a woman who told him that he was a very clever young man, but much mistaken in his thinking, because everyone knew that the world was flat and sat on the back of a turtle. When Russell asked her what the turtle was standing on, she replied, "You're very clever, young man, very clever, but it's turtles all the way down." The woman was wrong about the world, of course, but she would have been quite right if she'd been talking about magic. Great mages have wasted their lives trying to get at the root of magic. It is a futile pursuit, not much fun, and occasionally quite hazardous. Because the farther down you go, the bigger and scalier the turtles get, with sharper and sharper beaks, until eventually they start looking less like turtles and more like dragons. Everyone, take a marble, please, as you go. The very next afternoon, March taught them a simple chant to say over their marbles in a crooked gypsy-sounding language that Quentin didn't recognize. Later, Alice told him it was Estonian. Accompanied by a tricky gesture that involved moving the middle and pinky fingers on both hands independently, which is a lot harder than it sounds. Those who completed it successfully could leave early. The rest had to stay until they got it right. How would they know when they got it right? They would know. Quentin stayed until his voice was hoarse and his fingers were on fire, until the light in the windows had softened and changed color, and then sunk away completely, until his empty stomach ached, and dinner had been served and cleared away in the distant dining room. He stayed until his face was warm with shame, and all but 4 other people had stood up. Some of them pumped their fists in the air and said, "Yes!" and left the classroom. Alice had been the first after about 20 minutes, though she left silently. Finally, Quentin said the chant and made the motions. He didn't even know what he did differently this time, and was rewarded by the sight of his marble wobbling. Very slightly, but unmistakably, of its own volition. He didn't say anything, just put his head down on his desk, hiding his face in the crook of his elbow, and let the blood in his head throb in the darkness. The wooden desk was cool on his cheek. It hadn't been a fluke, or a hoax, or a joke. He had done it. Magic was real, and he could do it. And now that he could, my God, there was so much of it to do. That glass marble would be Quentin's constant companion for the rest of the semester. It was the cold, pitless glass heart of Professor March's approach to magical pedagogy. Every lecture, every exercise, every demonstration was concerned with how to manipulate and transform it using magic. For the next 4 months, Quentin was required to carry his marble everywhere. He fingered his marble under the table at dinner. It nestled in the inside pockets of his Breakbills jacket. When he showered, he tucked it in the soap dish. He took it to bed with him, and on those rare occasions when he slept, he dreamed about it. Quentin learned to cool his marble until it frosted over. He caused it to roll around a table by invisible means. He learned to float his marble in midair. He made it glow from within. Because it was already transparent, it was easy to render invisible. Upon which, he promptly lost it, and Professor March had to rematerialize it for him. Quentin made his marble float in water, pass through a wooden barrier, fly through an obstacle course, and attract iron fillings like a magnet. This was nuts and bolts work, ground-level fundamentals. The dramatic spellcasting display Quentin had performed during his exam, however showy and satisfying, he was told, was a well-understood anomaly, a flare-up of accumulated power that often manifested during a sorcerer's first casting. It would be years before he could do anything comparable again. In the meantime, Quentin also studied the history of magic, about which even magicians knew less than he would have thought. It turned out that magic users had always lived within mainstream society, but apart from it and largely unknown to it. The towering figures of magical history weren't famous at all in the mundane world, and the obvious guesses were way off base. Leonardo, Roger Bacon, Nostradamus, John Dee, Newton, sure, all of them were mages of various stripes, but the relatively modest ability. The fact that they were famous in mainstream circles was just a strike against them. By the standards of magical society, they'd fallen at the first hurdle. They hadn't had the basic good sense to keep their shit to themselves. Quentin's other homework, Popper's Practical Exercises for Young Magicians, turned out to be a thin, large-format volume containing a series of hideously complex finger and voice exercises arranged in order of increasing difficulty and painfulness. Much of spellcasting, Quentin gathered, consisted of very precise hand gestures accompanied by incantations to be spoken or chanted or whispered or yelled or sung. Any slight error in the movement or in the incantation would weaken or negate or pervert the spell. This wasn't Fillory. In each of the Fillory novels, one or two of the Chatwin children were always taken under the wing of a kindly Fillorian mentor who taught them a skill or a craft. In The World in the Walls, Martin becomes a master horseman, and Helen trains as a kind of forest scout. In the Flying Forest, forest scout. In The Flying Forest, Rupert becomes a dead-eye archer. In A Secret Sea, Fiona trains with a master fencer, and so on. The process of learning is a non-stop orgy of wonderment. Learning magic was nothing like that. It turned out to be about as tedious as it was possible for the study of powerful and mysterious supernatural forces to be. The same way a verb has to agree with its subject. It turned out even the simplest spell had to be modified and tweaked and inflected to agree with the time of day, the phase of the moon, the intention and purpose and precise circumstances of its casting, and 100 other factors, all of which were tabulated in volumes of tables and charts and diagrams printed in microscopic jewel type on huge yellowing elephant folio pages. And half of each page was taken up with footnotes listing the exceptions and irregularities and special cases, all of which had to be committed to memory, too. Magic was a lot wonkier than Quentin thought it would be. But there was something else to it, too. Something beyond all the practicing and memorizing, beyond the dotted I's and crossed T's, something that never came up in March's lectures. Quentin only sensed it without really being able to talk about it. But there was something else you needed if a spell was going to get any purchase on the world around you. Whenever he tried to think about it, he got lost in abstractions. It was something like force of will, a certain intensity of concentration, a clear vision, maybe a dash of artistic brio. If a spell was going to work, then on some gut level you had to mean it. He couldn't explain it, but Quentin could tell when it was working. He could sense his words and gestures getting traction on the mysterious magical substrate of the universe. He could feel it physically. His fingertips got warm, and they seemed to leave trails in the air. There was a slight resistance, as if the air was getting viscous around him, and pushing back against his hands and even against his lips and tongue. His mind buzzed with a caffeine cocaine fizz. He was at the heart of a large and powerful system. He was its heart. When it was working, he knew it, and he liked it. Now that his friends had come back from vacation, Elliot sat with them at meals instead. They were a highly visible clique, always earnestly conferring with each other and having fits of obstreperous public laughter, conspicuously fond of themselves and uninterested in the greater Breakbills populace. There was something different about them, though it was hard to say what. They weren't better looking or smarter than anybody else. They just seemed to know who they were, and they weren't constantly looking around at everybody else as if they could tell them. It ranked the it rankled the way Elliot had dropped Quentin the minute he ceased to be convenient. But then there were the 19 other first years to think of. Though they weren't a wildly social bunch, they were quiet and intense, always eyeing each other assessingly, as if they were trying to figure out who, if it came right down to it, would take out who in an electoral death match. They didn't congregate over much. They were always civil, but rarely warm. They were used to competing and used to winning. In other words, they were like Quentin, and Quentin wasn't used to being around people like himself. The one student he and every other first year at Breakbills was immediately obsessed with was little Alice, of the tiny glass creature, but it quickly became apparent that in spite of being way ahead of the rest of her year academically, she was cripplingly shy, to the point where there wasn't much point in trying to talk to her. When approached at meals, she answered questions and whispered monosyllables, her gaze dropping to the tablecloth in front of her as if weighed down by some infinite inner shame. She was almost pathologically unable to make eye contact, and she had a way of hiding her face behind her hair that made it clear how agonizing it was for her to be the object of human attention. Quentin wondered who or what could possibly have convinced somebody with such obvious gifts that she should be frightened of other people. He wanted to keep up a proper head of competitive steam, but instead he felt almost protective of her. The one and only time he saw Alice look genuinely happy was when he watched her, alone and momentarily unself-conscious, successfully skip a pebble across the pool in a fountain and between the legs of a stone nymph. Life at Breakbills had a hushed, formal, almost theatrical tone to it, and at mealtimes formality was elevated to the level of a fetish. Dinners were served promptly at 6:30. Latecomers were denied the privilege of a chair and ate standing. Faculty and students sat together in one interminable table that was swathed in a tablecloth of mystical whiteness and laid with heavy-handled silverware that didn't match. Illumination was provided by battalions of hideous candelabras. The food, contrary to private school tradition, was excellent in an old-fashioned, Frenchified way. Menus tended toward mid-century war horses like Bauf Indau and lobster Thermidor. First years had the privilege of serving all the other students as waiters, under the stern direction of Chambers, and then eating by themselves when everybody else was done. Third and fourth years were allowed 1 glass of wine with dinner. Fifth years, or Finns, as they were called for no obvious reason, got 2. Oddly enough, there were only 10 fourth years, half the usual number, and nobody would explain why. Asking about it just ended the conversation. All this Quentin picked up with the speed of a sailor castaway on a savage foreign continent, who has no choice but to learn the local language as rapidly as possible, or be devoured by those who speak it. His first 2 months at Breakbills spun by, and soon red and gold leaves were scattering across the sea as if they were being pushed by invisible brooms, which possibly they were, and the flanks of the slow-moving topiary beasts in the maze showed streaks of color. Quentin devoted a half-hour every day after class to exploring the campus on foot. One blustery afternoon he stumbled onto a pocket vineyard, a postage stamp of earth ruled into straight lines and planted with rows of grapevines strung up on rusty wires and trained into weird vinicultural candelabra shapes. By now, the grapes had already been harvested, and those that hadn't had shriveled on the vine into tiny, fragrant raisins. Beyond it, a quarter-mile off into the woods, at the end of a narrow path, Quentin discovered a small field, neatly divided into a patchwork of squares. Some of the squares were grass, some were stone, some were sand, some were water, and 2 were made of blackened, silvery metal elaborately inscribed. There was no fence or wall to mark the edge of the grounds, or if there was, he never found it. There was just the river along one side and woods all around the rest. Even so, the faculty seemed to spend an inordinate amount of time maintaining the spells that kept the school invisible and impregnable to outsiders. They were constantly strolling the perimeter, studying things Quentin couldn't see, and pulling one another out of classes to consult about it. That's it for this week. Next week we will read Chapter 5.